I'm Shoma Chaudhury. Thank you for watching Inquiry. While COVID continues to command global attention, last week in India, amidst the tragic and ongoing migrant crisis, two other episodes dominated headlines. One episode involved a group called BoisLockerRoom on Instagram, where young minor boys shared photographs of young minor girls and spoke casually about raping them. Another episode, also on Instagram, involved a minor girl accusing a minor boy of molesting her 2 years previously and the boy committing suicide. Both these episodes spotlight deeply troubling issues in our society and psyche. The first is the issue of masculinity and how it's constructed, why misogyny and aggression towards women is so entrenched. The other is the pervasive presence of social media with both its positive and extremely dangerous impacts. So, how is one to sift through these complex issues? How can toxic masculinity be rooted out? What do men feel about it? How can we open the locks of the mind and engender a healthy relation between sexes? Like COVID, this virus of problematic masculinity cuts across borders. What plagues India plagues other countries as well. So I'm delighted to introduce our guest at Inquiry, Tina Brown. Tina is a legend in American media. She's been the editor of Tatler, Vanity Fair, New Yorker, Daily Beast, Newsweek. She's walked the corridors of power, politics, media, and glamour for close to 50 years. She's commissioned 30,000 word pieces on revolutions in El Salvador, and she's also put Demi Moore naked and pregnant on the cover of Vanity Fair. But what makes her truly unique is her championing of talent, her curious temperament, her greed for observation, and what Meryl Streep calls her completely open and permeable mind. Thank you so much for joining us, Tina.
Thank you, Shoma. Back at you.
There's much I'd like to discuss with you, Tina. But first, I would like to explore this deeply troubling issue of masculinity and how it's constructed. Like I said, you walked the corridors of male power for many decades. You even briefly worked with Harvey Weinstein. So, how do you define masculinity and what has gone wrong with it?
Well, I think to me, masculinity is about not feeling that you have to show it. You know, this is the great confidence that a man has that doesn't feel that they have to be braggadocio, doesn't feel that they have to be sexual overtly, but has a kind of quiet assertiveness that I think is what defines what I call real masculinity. One of the most appealing sort of masculine men I know actually is Admiral McRaven, who was the leader of the Navy SEALs, who was he was in charge of the Navy SEALs when they caught Osama bin Laden. And, you know, you could not have a more masculine guy, actually, but he expresses it with a kind of quiet strength that is the absolute opposite of, you know, the Donald Trump swaggering, you know, macho effect. And that's what I think men need to kind of feel more of, that actually it's really about confidence and generosity and kindness to and supportiveness to women. I mean, women, it's not, you know, women should want to actually be taken care of, but in the right way. You know, you don't want to be stifled, but there's nothing more appealing to a woman than a man who is her peer, her surround, you know, her deep comfort in a sense. That's real masculinity.
So, according to you, what perpetuates this toxic masculinity, Tina? What was so shocking about the Boys Locker Room episode was that this was a new generation of boys. They're privileged, they go to good schools, they've had exposure, and yet the misogyny in varying degrees is there in every strata of society. So why is this other positive model of masculinity so hard to find?
Unfortunately, we don't see much expression of that in pop culture, in music, I mean, in any of the kind of social media that we're hearing. There's a kind of awful trend, I guess, which I think comes out of pornography a lot. I mean, I don't think that people are blaming porn enough, you know, because I think so many young men now, they're really raised on porn from a very, very early age. And they really believe that women like the stuff that is done to other women in porn. And actually they don't. Young men now feel is something that is an expression of sexuality. And the girls feel ashamed really of the fact, I think a lot of the time, that that's actually not what they want. I mean, they still do have a hankering for somebody who, quote, woos them a bit. Sex still has meaning. And I don't think that that is a square thing to be saying. I mean, I see it amongst the young women I know who really sort of contracted out, in a sense, many of them, of having a sort of sexuality that, frankly, my generation, had in abundance. There's a lot of just contracting out.
Could you explain that phrase, Tina, contracting out? What do you mean by that?
Well, I mean, I think there's a lot of young women right now who just don't seem to be engaged really in kind of sexual activities. They're kind of over it. They've had so many bad experiences on, in our case, Tinder, the dating app.
Yeah.
They've had so many situations where men on these social apps basically are treating them like, call out pizza. I know a great many young women actually who don't really have a boyfriend, who spend a lot of time with one another. And I look at them and I kind of think, well, where is this going? There isn't a lot of sexual abandon in this group, as far as I can see. I mean, it's quite an introverted mood amongst a lot of young women, I think, today.
'Cause little did we know, the good times come and go, but the best is yet to come.
That's a startling insight, Tina, and a sad fallout if the sexes lose all faith in each other. But before we explore more of that, I wanted to ask you about Harvey Weinstein. You worked very closely with him. So is he symptomatic of what was wrong with an older generation? And can you at all distinguish between what was toxic in an older generation of men and the masculinity of a new generation? Is there any difference?
I mean, I have to say, Harvey Weinstein was in a class by himself. He was a completely crazed rhino of a person. I mean, he really was. He was out of control, profane, aggressive, loony guy, really. I mean, he also was very, very talented, however, and was a Jekyll and Hyde about the way he sort of presented. I mean, the Harvey Weinstein who wooed, romanced, and persuaded me to leave the best job in American journalism to go work with him, to do, as he described it, everything I wanted to do at the New York. And he's a great business guy, and he knew that that was the right thing to do. But at the same time, as soon as I went to work for him and saw this kind of raging bull in action, he was so just paranoid, tempestuous, seedy. Everything about him was just so awful. And at first I thought, well, it's just me. I mean, I'm just this kind of Condé Nast princess who, used to the sort of life of publishing in a very upmarket surround, all the rest of it. I've got to like buckle down and realize this is the new way of doing things. But I soon realized that, the way he humiliated people all the time was so grotesque. So I don't think that Harvey Weinstein, honestly, is a kind of any kind of barometer of masculinity. He had no masculinity. That was his issue. There was no masculinity about Harvey. He was a terrified baby. If you pushed back on Harvey, he collapsed. He was just like Trump. Compulsive lies, similar in the capriciousness, but he also had extraordinary taste. And that was the thing that's interesting to me, was just, the beauty and the beast aspect of it. Harvey's issue really was that he was this terrible, gross, ugly man. And in there was this amazing taste and this sensitivity to material. There was a lot of berating of everybody who worked with him as enablers and so on, but Harvey's taste was important in the cinema, and he got really amazing work done that only he could do because of the other side of him, where he would just bully it through. So it's all very complicated, and it's amazing though to think of him there sitting there in prison, upstate New York. And he's not coming out for 29 years.
Yes, it is very complicated. And yet there was so much aggression and entitlement and assumption of rights among men. There was so much brewing there that the Me Too movement came like a geyser burst. So do you see any intergenerational shift in attitude among men?
I think men are really lost right now, actually. I mean, I don't think they know what to be. Because on the one hand, we're talking about how the young men are expressing it with this kind of super sexual braggadocio, gang rape kind of discussion, etc. But then there's also, the older men many of them have been Me Too'd. They're absolutely terrified of expressing any kind of alpha sort of warmth, if you like. You saw it with the sort of Joe Biden, which has now exploded again. But, there was all of the questions, when he first began to run, about how he was touching women's hair and squeezing their backs, and this kind of huge kind of tsunami of outrage that he was such a, quote, handsy, but actually that's sort of how he expressed it himself. He's a sort of big, warm guy of a different era. You could see how it paralyzed him, actually. You could see, part of the reason he's such a lousy candidate is that he feels, I think, stripped of his natural personality that he thought was in himself and that he felt was attractive. But actually now he's being told that he was being kind of invading people's space and he was sort of repellent. Now we have an accusation that he actually did slam a girl up against a wall in the 90s. Nobody quite knows what to think about that. It's divided the left very much because, of course, there's a big portion of the left who feel, we cannot be hypocritical, believe every woman, she's made the statement about him, we cannot ignore this just because he's on our side of the political fence. And then there are the others, of course, who feel this is completely out of his character. We've never heard anything like this about Joe Biden before. And now we're in the middle of the COVID virus, and why do we need to even be discussing this? I think men are just very, very confused. And I think that maybe one of the reasons why they're sort of congregating on social media with all this braggadocio is because, frankly, they feel very insecure of their masculinity, because they feel, frankly, so naked and shivering and tiny. How are you a masculine man today when you have the Me Too police and when you have, at the same other side of it, this expectation that you're going to be a kind of porn stud?
Tina, condemnation is one part of it, but there's several other aspects as well. How can the breakdown between sexes be resolved? At one level, the lines are very clear. The line between desire and disrespect, between, just violence, aggression, intrusion, objectification. There's no real confusion around those areas. But at another level, young boys are expressing confusion over mating games that go wrong. And so I wanted to also explore the issue of consequences. You mentioned how the response to Joe Biden's case has divided the left. There's some amount of divided opinion here too. Vis-a-vis the boys' locker room, there's absolutely no confusion. It's shocking. But there's some who want the minors to be arrested and the police to lead the response. There are other child rights activists and psychologists who are saying that this is a symptom of a deeper societal malaise and there should be a social response. The other, the tragic episode about the suicide of the minor accusing the other minor is even more complicated. So where do you stand on this spectrum?
I really do feel due process is incredibly important because there are a lot of serious actions in terms of, assaulting women, of course, that absolutely must be penalized to the hilt, whatever age you are. But I also think that the way men and women relate to each other, particularly young and on campuses, is just not an issue that's getting enough training, if you like, attention. They are literally just thrown into this sea of sexuality when they get to college. And, it's all porn-based, as I said, and social media, and it's a very scary landscape. And I actually think how much work is really being done with with kids about how they're supposed to interact with each other in a way that is different from that. And it might sound sort of square, but I actually think there needs to be more sort of training, if you like, on what the new rules are. And it's also, I think young men as well are also very scared because, again, they don't even really know how to make an overture that's not going to be seen as some kind of harassment. So at the same time, I think that while girls need to be absolutely confident that when they speak out, they will be heard, you also don't want to put young men into a situation where policing of every single natural instinct they have to warmly suggest that they're interested in somebody. There has to be ground rules for women to understand what is supposedly a barrier. I think the notion that, men have to kind of literally sort of ring fence themselves when they talk to a woman and have to ask her the rules of commitment. I mean, there's no relationships that are ever going to come out of that. And it probably creates quite a lot of anger in the men. So I'm really much more in favor of genuine sort of training on the issues and actual groups where this is discussed between young men and young women. These sort of sexual orientation things and classes where I think that they always tend to get ridiculed by the people who do it. They seem to be a kind of corporate fig leaf for, well, we've done that, you've had your sexual harassment training, that's done. But there really isn't anything where the sort of men and women together talk about what is a kind of comfortable way of talking. And I think that men would actually like that as much as women would in the end. It'd be much more real.
Right. I think a young woman put it very well to me, and she said, I think what boys have to develop is the art of looking, and that the art of looking should not be offensive. It should not make girls feel threatened or debased. And, that's something that I think this generation is trying to work out what the new...
Yeah, no, it's interesting, and the art of looking. I mean, if they're able to do that to a young man with raging hormones, it's hard for them to develop the art of looking without feeling that, as they feel.
So, Tina, you said there was something individualized about Harvey Weinstein's personality, and that his toxicity was so extreme that it's not really symptomatic of an older generation. But the Me Too movement has brought out so many other episodes as well. So I just wanted to circle back to the other part of my question, which is that, do you see any shift in generations of men? What was toxic earlier and what's going wrong with young boys now?
Not all the masculinity of that generation is toxic. I mean, there is a kind of an alpha man who we all recognize. And I mean, I can think of men like Ben Bradley or, the great American editor of the Washington Post. I mean, he was the sort of archetypal sort of alpha guy, those kind of men. Is it toxic to be like that? I don't think we ever thought so at the time, and I don't think that they were. And the question is there going to be any room for men of that kind of affect going forward? How do men of that kind of those big alpha guys, how do they sort of express themselves? Obviously, not harassing women is one way.
So how do we break out of these kind of locks of the mind, Tina? The pushback is totally necessary, and yet one does not want to create an atmosphere where there's only suspicion and resentment between the sexes and one feels that the other doesn't understand them. So how can we arrive at a more healthy situation?
One of the things I think is wonderful about the next generation of men is that they're definitely different kinds of parent. The fact that they are co-parenting, as definitely has definitely changes their sort of masculinity sort of depth, if you like. Brings out a different kind of humanity, which I think is a wonderful thing. And I'm hoping that's that constant. I mean, you see it even with like a Prince Harry and Archie, if you know what I mean. There is something deeply affecting about seeing this kind of very masculine young man adoring his baby in a way that sort of might perhaps in other generations have not been seen. The more you see young men in that parenting role, the more they're going to become men of wholeness that can express their sexuality in healthier ways.
That's a lovely insight, Tina, and totally true. Because while there are awful episodes and the whole strain of misogyny continues, and there is this kind of suspicion and resentment between the sexes, there's also a lot of positive movement. So what do you think have been the gains of the Me Too movement?
I really love the way the Me Too movement has put so many people on notice. They do have power structures that are on the run, which is good. I mean, they are forcing corporates in particular to consider the women in ways that they didn't, and stop talking about the fact that they have so many, a pipeline of women in management. That's the word that just drives me insane, this pipeline. It's like this exploding pipeline, this with all this gushing pipeline, right? Because they somehow never seem to make it to the end of this pipeline, right? So I think that there is a certain amount of calling bullshit on that. I really like that. Boards now are telling their CEOs, what are you doing with the top women? And if they're leaving, why are they leaving? I think there's much more accountability on that score. We've seen all these great women running for office in the US. So there's a lot of big surge of women candidates who are winning and are winning. So I think, I think Me Too has actually been extremely it's been a wonderful way of saying enough of talking about it. We need to get the big gains in terms of, the equal pay and the finally getting paid family leave in the US. I mean, it's absolutely incredible that American women are the only country other than Papua New Guinea that doesn't have, some kind of mandatory maternity leave. Those are the things we have to focus on.
Right. So far, Tina, we've been talking about men and what's wrong with them and what they need to do. But we also want to make them part of the process. One doesn't want to only create a kind of sense of alienation. So while the fight is really important, needs to be done and must continue, is there kind of, new space or new agency that women can inhabit as well? Is there a new tonality or layer that needs to come into the movement?
As far as I'm concerned, the Me Too piece of it to me, has always been about imbalance of power. Absolutely, it is. I mean, if you are, a woman working in a situation where the boss is harassing you and you have no alternative, you are absolutely in an abusive situation. It's about that kind of power imbalance. I think women actually are not perhaps acknowledging how powerful they are, though, in their own situations. I mean, I think, the notion that it's only men who are powerful is not right. I mean, the women have a lot of power. They're so often much more, emotionally grounded, smart. So I think that, women understanding their power, they need to respect their own power and understand sometimes you express it in different ways. I mean, you may not be expressing your power in a way that's obvious to the world, but you can still be the power in the relationship because you have set your own boundaries, set your own limits, and also made it clear what you won't do in that relationship, and that doesn't even have to be spoken sometimes. It just has to be acted out. So I think women need to be a bit more proud of their own power and not present themselves as weak always in that situation. Maybe, voting with your feet is just, a very important thing.
Right. So, Tina, you provided a positive definition of masculinity. Ironically, bizarrely, feminism too has become a kind of complicated word. Many people see it as equivalent to intolerance or to a kind of stridency that doesn't allow for anyone else's experience or thoughts. What would you define feminism? What is feminism to you?
Oh, I mean, I feel I'm a passionate feminist. It's about fighting for your place at the table and making sure that you have it. I think feminism is essential and it should be a feminism of action. Also about creating a bit of a sisterhood yourself. I mean, I felt that in Women in the World, which was this, platform I created, I was so proud of being able to bring these extraordinary women in, these global women from all over the world who've done these remarkable things and help build their network, help build their outreach, help build their donor circle, all the things that we did, I felt, was essential for me, as a woman to be doing at this point in my life. I want to see those women get what they deserve. I'm tired of seeing women at the top, but not at the top. That awful kind of level where they stick and then over them is a man. And I see this all over the place. There is this amazing woman who's holding everything together and there's a man who's out there, paid twice the amount. That has to just end, and I feel that is the role of feminism now, is to push it up that last piece of the hill,
Right. So I wanted to just shift gear for a bit, Tina, and ask you about COVID. It's impacted everybody in such deep ways. How has it impacted you? What change in psyche has it created?
It's very interesting. At the beginning of this year, I wrote in my diary in early January, this is going to be the year of the great unraveling. I went to Davos this year and I was sitting there doing an interview with the new head of the IMF, Kristalina Georgieva. And I said to her, have you thought about what would happen if there was a massive cataclysmic, natural event? And I said, a green swan, because I was thinking, of course, of climate, because we were all fixated on climate change. And this year at Davos, that's all that anybody talked about. I was thinking recently, as I was sitting there in January the 21st, or whenever that was, with her talking about this. As we were sitting there, this very event, in a wet market in Wuhan or wherever the hell they decided started, had actually started. And I look back on that moment now as almost as a kind of the end of a certain world. Right now, if Trump comes back, it's going to be a really ugly, ugly world, which I think is a very, very strong likelihood.
In fact, that was going to be my next question, Tina, which is that one is seeing this rise of toxic masculinity across the world, even amongst leadership. And again, one can condemn it, and one does, but sometimes that feels like the converted talking to the converted. The fact is that men like Trump have a huge following. He's very popular. And so what is the causality of that? And do you think liberals need to do some soul searching about it?
Absolutely, liberals do. And I think that the constant sort of policing of speech greatly aggravated people. It's the same reason we got Brexit in England, was because liberal media really made certain topics so off limits. For instance, in England with Brexit, immigration had become, a real talking point in every community. That if you were, living in a town where you couldn't get an appointment on the National Health because it was like Polish immigrants were all, had all come in and they taking every spot and taking the spots in the schools, and people were angry. They were very angry. But if you raised the discussion in any way, you were called a racist, you were called, a reactionary, and so on. So those conversations sort of weren't allowed to happen in the public space. And then what, of course, happens when you suppress a conversation like that in the public space, it really goes underground and goes toxic. And I think the same thing really has happened in the United States, because the endless kind of berating of any kind of sort of open dialogue about discussions like that. And of course, then there were much bigger social issues after the financial crisis in 2008, was that entire section of the society that didn't feel they got anything like their standard of living back again. So the combination of the anger about that, but the social attitudes, I think, were really much more potent as the reason that people like Trump. And it has become so solidified. It's absolutely amazing. I mean, for instance, when Trump the other day talked about how we should all think about drinking bleach, right? I mean, it was so bonkers. I said to somebody, because I'm always looking for the tipping point, right? I'm always looking for the thing. When Trump said drink bleach, you got to say that was bonkers. And he said, they always say the same thing. You just don't get it, do you? I go like, don't get what? He's an entrepreneur. Trump is an entrepreneur. He was brainstorming solutions. That's what entrepreneurs do. That's what business guys do. He was just, you just don't get it. You don't understand. And I think it kind of crushed me, because I just thought it's hopeless, but at the same time, it shows how deeply this anger, has become entrenched in people. I definitely think that the liberals have a lot to blame. Cable news is just nonstop Trump outrage. Doesn't matter what he said or does. And, a lot of what he says and does is just appalling. But there's other stuff that really you could let it go. And they don't let it go. And that's what makes people furious.
It's interesting you say that, Tina, because really these issues are so complicated. And, maybe there's some amount of soul searching to do even amongst the women's movement, because while the Me Too movement was historic, like so important, needed to happen, yet there's been a certain amount of closing down of dialogue, where it's not just men, but even women feel that they can't entirely speak up. They can't, voice different layers of argument. And that's not a healthy thing for anybody, not for men and not for women either.
Absolutely. I mean, there are so many smart thinker women I know, who are academics, who just don't want to opine about it. They don't want to have the dialogue because they can't take being shut down, slammed. So yeah, no, you feel in danger every time you open your mouth about it. And it's such a complex issue, because the disgusting way that men have got off, for so long is deeply enraging.
Yes.
But at the same time, I just want to make sure that we don't lose sight of the genuine due process, because otherwise, you're going to, in the end, have this big blowback. It's interesting, though, because, the fact is that, with this Joe Biden business, it's just not impacting his poll numbers at all. I think the noise of social media very often is misleading. People on social media are other people on social media, but there's a huge amount of other people, the majority, who aren't. So it's also can be misleading, I think, in politics to keep thinking necessarily that, you can't speak about certain things and you'll get a bad press for it, because actually, as I say, in the case of Biden right now, it's not impacting him at all.
Right. So elsewhere, Tina, you've used this phrase that women are feeling stalled and furious and men are feeling raw and vulnerable. So can you explain that a little bit more? And also, I wanted to ask you about social media. How much is it aiding and how much is it kind of, making it difficult to have a healthy discourse around all of this?
It's all about really being able to be honest, I think, about your feelings and feel heard. I think people are afraid of not being heard or being obliterated by the social reaction. There's no doubt that social media has amplified that tremendously. Nobody likes a mob going after you in any direction. I don't want the gains of Me Too to be forgotten. I worry that the noise of Me Too is more abrasive than the actual changes on behalf of women.
Tina, I just wanted to pursue a line of questioning we were speaking of earlier, which is about pop culture. We spoke about porn and social media, but cinema is a large part of it, and opinion is very divided on that as well. Some feel that art should be educative and set positive models. What do you feel about that?
I strongly hope that art isn't expected to be educative. The best art doesn't know any kind of boundary. And I hate the idea that artists have to be censored for their personal conduct. I don't think, I don't want to see a great artist struck from the curriculum because of their personal lives. I wouldn't want to see that. I know that that's happening. I regret that, because I think art should live on beyond the person who created it, myself. But I think we're heading in that direction whereby, if you didn't live according to the rules, you're not going to be studied in college, which I think, is a disaster.
One can critique the person, condemn the person, and still examine and engage with the work. So, Tina, to end with, I'd like to ask you again about COVID, the big cataclysmic event in all our lives. What is it that you most fear about a post-COVID world? And is there anything that you see as a silver lining?
A turning inwards. I fear a society turning inwards, that there a sense of, instead of the message being, we need to project out, we need to kind of put our arms around the world, much more of a sense of, we're going to hunker down, we're going to close the blinds, we're going to just take care of ourselves and sort of weather the storm out. I hate that feeling. I mean, I'd like to feel that the world was going to take from this a message of breaking out and wrapping around and reaching out, and I fear we're going in the other direction.
Hopefully we'll meet and hug soon. Thank you so much, Tina.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. You've been incredible.
Love to see you, Shoma. Absolutely. The other side of COVID.